Uh, Actually, he is in the northern areas of Pakistan. He had some meetings over there, so maybe there is some issue in connectivity, but he'll join. He has promised us. So we can formally start. And thank you very much, Professor Justin Yifulin, for giving us time to come here online at least. Maybe some future time you will also come to Pakistan Institute of Development Economics physically as well. Just briefly, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics is a policy think tank associated with Planning Commission of Pakistan. And we engage with our stakeholders and the general audience along with academia on different policy issues like today's and other. And we have also a CPEC Center of Excellence hosted by PIDE, which is basically the research side of the CPEC. To introduce you to our audience, I'll briefly go over some of your details, which I could jot down, although your CV is quite long, but just to cover for that, you're currently Dean of Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University. And you had also been the Dean of Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development and Professor and Honorary Dean of National School of Development at Peking University. Professor was also the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at World Bank from 2008 to 2012. And prior to this, Mr. Lin has also served for 15 years as Founding Director and Professor of the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University. Professor is Counselor of State Council and a member of Standing Committee on Chinese People's Political Consultation Conference. He is also author of more than 20 books, including, but not limited to, Beating the Odd, Jumping Start Developing Countries, Going Beyond Aid, Development Cooperation for Structural Transformation, The Quest for Prosperity, How Developing Economies Can Take Off, New Structural Economics, a Framework for Rethinking Development and Policy, Against the Consensus, Reflections on the Great Recession, and Demystifying the Chinese Economy. Professor is a corresponding fellow of British Academy and a fellow of the Academy of Sciences for Developing World. He has done a lot of research work, and all of his work is very exciting. We have been reading it, and we are delighted that you have spared time to join us in terms of speaking on the very important topic of the new structural economics and its policy insights for Pakistan development. So really looking forward for your presentation and the question answer sessions afterwards. Thank you very much. And over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid. And it's my honor to share with you the new structural economics and some recommendations for policies in Pakistan. And a dynamically growing country is a dream. Every countries, certainly including, but Pakistan in income for decades since independence. So certainly the is somewhat in for friends. And we know that economic growth is a process of change. It's technological innovation in the industries. Industrial up to higher added. And by this, we can raise the labor, and that is the foundation for increase. But process of movement, infrastructure, so infrastructure, which will reduce cost, the productivity embodied in and modern. Further developing, there is a way called advantage of back in technology innovation and industry, because by that way, the cost and risk for technology industrial upgrading will be much than the high-income country. So potentially, developing countries can grow. Them are, however, and most other developing countries have been trapped in low income or middle income status, since the Second World War. And so this phenomenon is puzzling. The potential is there, but how come the developing country cannot realize the potential? And just like Keynes said, it is ideas, not vested interest, which are dangerous for good or evil. So I think the value to tap that potential mostly is because of the actions of the efforts are guided by wrong ideas or inappropriate ideas. So we need to look into the ideas embodied in the development economics, because development economics is a new subdiscipline in modern economics, and it appears it emerged only after the Second World War, when most of the developing countries gaining political independence from colonial powers and started their own modernization. The first generation of development economics, now we call it structuralism. And structuralism, the main idea at the time was all the developing countries had the aspiration to catch up the high-income country with the same income status as the high-income country. But if you wanted to have the same income level, you need to have the same productivity level. But if you want to have the same productivity as in the high-income country, then you should have the same advanced industries. And it seems to be very logical in its reasoning. However, in the developing country, those kind of modern advanced industry could not develop spontaneously by market forces. So the perception at that time, but there were widespread market failures due to some kind of structural rigidity, cultural heritage, and so on. So the market cannot allocate those resources to the advanced industries. Since there were market failures, so the recommendation is to have the government play the proactive role to mobilize the resources directly and invest those kind of resources to the modern industries in a policy framework called impulse substitutions. And the country followed this approach. Almost all the countries, including those in the socialist camp, they basically all followed this kind of approach. And with this approach, they were able to have about 5 or 10 years very rapid dynamic economic growth. And during the period of time, they built up some modern industries. But after that, their economy started to stagnate and hit by crises from time to time. And as a result, the gap between the high-income country and the developing country continue to be widening. So the results certainly are disappointing. Then by the time of the late 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, all the developing countries were on the process of transition from the government-led development model to market-oriented models. And at that time, the prevailing ideas, as you know, is neoliberalism. And their understanding for the values in country were too widespread government interventions, causing all kinds of government values, misallocation, rent-seeking, and so on. And the prescription from the neoliberalism, as you know, is to, have the well-functioning market system as in the advanced country in order to improve the economic performance. And the recommendation was Washington consensus, marketization, privatization, stabilization. And the result, most of the transition economy followed that approach. In former Soviet Union, Eastern European countries, Latin America, and also in Africa. But even though they built up the modern market institutions, their economy collapsed and the crisis, erupted, frequently. And actually, if you compare the rate of growth during the neoliberalism period in 1980 and the 1990s was lower than the average annual growth rate of the developing country in the 1960s and the 70s under the structuralism, and the frequencies of the crisis was even higher in the later period than in the earlier period. So some economists refer the 1980s, 1990s as the lost decades of the developing country. And in this period of time, there were a few successful economies. The first one certainly was the East Asian tigers, and they grew very rapidly in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s to become newly industrialized and across the gap with the high-income, economies. But they did not follow the structuralism. Instead of import substitution, they adopted export promotion. Instead of ambitiously trying to build up large-scale modern industries, they started with small-scale, traditional, labor-intensive manufacturing. And those kind of approach was considered as a wrong approach by the structuralism, but they were successful. And in the 1980s, in the transition, as you know, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and earlier Mauritius, they also transited from the government-led model to market-led models. And they adopted certain kind of gradual dual-track approach for the transition. They continue to provide subsidies and protection to the older sectors, but they liberalized the entry to the new sectors. And this approach was considered as the worst possible approach for transition by the neoliberalism. And the argument at that time was this approach will make the performance of the country even worse than in the planning economy. But however, there were a few, transition countries to be able to maintain stability and dynamic economic growth. And so from this, we also find that the successful economies, they had something in common. They are either market economies or they transit to market. And so from this point of view, neoliberalism seems to be right. However, they also have very proactive state, just like the state prescribed by the structuralism. So they were some kind of hybrid, and they cannot explain by, their success cannot be explained by neoliberalism or by the structuralism. And so from this, we can see countries follow the mainstream ideas failed. And the successful economies cannot be explained by the efficient ideas. And so that's the reason why we need to have a rethinking. And when I started to think about what I call the new structural economics, I always argue we should go back to the Adam Smith. But when I say we should go back to the Adam Smith, I do not mean that we should, go back to the ideas that advocate by the Adam Smith. The idea, as you know, market is very important, and you need division of labor, and you have, and that we are. Those are the ideas advocated by the world. But going back to the Adam, is that we should go back to the methodology that Adam Smith adapted to get his findings. And the approach, the methodology actually is the title, that is an inquiry into the nature and the causes of the wealth of the nations. And so if we want to understand economic development, we should have an inquiry into the nature and the causes of economic development. And the nature of modern economics is something new that appeared only after the 18th century. Before the 18th century, all the countries in the world, including those in the Western Europe and other parts of the world, were stagnant. Only after the 18th century, first in the Western Europe and later North America, they started to have a very rapid economic growth. And as you know, it was the result of industrial revolution. And in this industrial revolution, certainly, they had continual technological innovation as well as new industry to appear, which raised the labor productivities. And they also continue to improve their hard infrastructure, power supply, irrigation, road network, and also institution, as I mentioned, to reduce the transaction cost. And so modern economic growth actually is a process of structural transformation. And I wanted to use the economic approach, that is a neoclassic approach, to study the determinants and the impact of economic structure and its evolution, because that is the nature of modern economic growth. And I like to understand what are the determinants. And why I call my approach new structural economics, because by convention, if I apply the neoclassical approach to study structure, I should refer this type of study structural economics. But because there was structuralism before me, so I add a new to distinguish my approach from the structuralism, just like the new institutional economics. Douglas North started to advocate the use of neoclassic approach to study the institution and institutional evolution. He should refer his approach as institutional economics, but also, as you know, in the US at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they have an institutional school. And to distinguish his approach from institutional school, he refers his approach, new institutional economics. So new structural economic implication. And to present the main thrust of the new structural economics, that my main hypothesis is that industrial structure and other economic structure are endogenous to the endowment structure, which is given at any specific time and changeable over time. And why endowment structure are so important? Because endowment structure will determine the competitive advantages of the industry and technology at any specific time in an economy. If all your industry with your competitive, you can have loss of a factor cost of, and if the hard and soft inflation to reduce cost, then competitive. So if all consistent with your risk, then there can be as the optimal structure. And in fact, we like to have economic growth income. But if you want activities, the level of industries, but your industry are endogenous to the endowment structure. So before you can successfully upgrade your industries, you need to upgrade your endowment structure from lack of capital and abundant in labor force or abundant and natural resources to become abundant relatively in capital. If you can have those kind of changes in the, then certainly you will change your competitive advantages and you can upgrade your industries. But once you upgrade your industries, you also need to improve your hard infrastructure and institution to reduce transaction costs in order to make the economy competitive. So when a country is trapped in low income status or middle income status, that means the country cannot have a very dynamic changes in its structural transformation. And what would be the best approach to have this kind of a dynamic structural transformation? And from the ideas that embedded in this new structural economics and its indigeneity of structure to the endowment structure. The best way to achieve dynamic economic growth is to follow the competitive advantages determined by your factor endowments at any specific time to develop your industries and to compatible technologies. And if you do that, you can have lowest factor cost of productions. And also, if you have suitable hard and soft infrastructure, your transaction costs will also be low. And by that, certainly, the economy can be very competitive. And if your economy is very competitive, the firm will be profitable. The whole economy will have a large economic surplus, so you have more to save. And also, your investment is along the line of your competitive advantages. The return to investment will be high, so you have more to save, and you also have high incentive save. And by that, your factor endowments can change the fastest possible way, and you can upgrade your industries and technology. And for a developing country, in this process, they can enjoy the latecomers advantages to reduce the cost of technological innovation, industrial upgrading, as well as the risk of technological innovation and industrial upgrading, and so they can grow faster than the developed country, and they can close the gap. But to follow the competitive advantages in industrial upgrading and technological innovation is a concept only can be understood by economists. And how can we turn this kind of economic principle to some kind of spontaneous choice of the entrepreneur? For that, we need to have market institution, because you need to have relative prices which can reflect the relative scarcity of your factor endowments. And if you have those kind of relative prices, certainly for reducing the cost and increase the competitiveness, then the entrepreneur will be guided by the factor endowments to enter into the industries we can utilize your abundant factor in your endowments in order to reduce the cost of production. So adopt technology which is also consistent with the relative abundance of your factor endowments. When you have abundant labor force and a scarcity in the capitals, then labor force will be, capital will be, and then the labor force replaced. Then those kind of technology labor intensive, and they will also which can use abundant factors later in a scale, and that will be labor and vice versa. Competitive market system to govern and adapt according to its competitive. But we are talking economic development. Certainly it's important. At the same time, it's a transformation. This process, you need to enter the new industries, also to and the first we need to face then the follower. You need to provide to the first mover, because no matter it's a failure or it's a success, they provide important information for the whole economy. And that's the externality compensation. And also whether the first mover will be successful or not. On the one hand, depends on the industry that the first mover enters are consistent with the competitive advantage of the economy or not. But also, on the other hand, whether the economies have the adequate hard infrastructure and soft institutions. And those kind of hard infrastructure and soft institutions require coordinations by the government or provided by the government. And so with this regard, if you want to have a dynamic economic growth along the line of the country's competitive advantages, you also need to have a facilitation state to compensate the externality generated by the first movers, and also to improve the hard infrastructure and institutions according to the need of new competitive advantages. And from this framework, it's very easy for us to understand why the structuralism failed. The structuralism, advised the governments to develop modern industries, prevailing in high-income countries that too capital intensive, and so that's went against the country's competitive advantages, and because those kind of target industry went against the country competitive advantages, then the firm in those kind of industry will not be viable in open competitive market, because factor cost of production in the country will be much higher than the factor cost of production in countries which those industry are consistent with their competitive advantages. Since they are not viable, so the government would have to give them subsidy and protections to encourage investment and to maintain their operations. But this kind of government subsidies and protection certainly will cause all distortion and resulting in misallocation of rent-seeking, corruption, and five, the intent to advance to a larger scale of industry is but the result. Those are a few economies in Taiwan and Singapore. They start a traditional intensive industry. And they, developing economies, they had about endowment, so that's consistent with advantages. And active government for they also reduced, so they could be competitive. So they are competitive one, certainly then export more, appear to be development. So structural economics can exist in a value. And also we can see why Washington consensus failed in the transition. Because the Washington consensus neoliberalism, ignore the distortions or protection and subsidies or endogenously to the need of protecting the non-viable forms. And if you remove all those kind of distortions or protection and subsidies, the non-viable form will go bankrupt and causing mass unemployment and social political instability. And without social political instability, certainly you cannot develop the economy. And also some of those kind of other industries are essential for the national security, as well as the economic operation, like a power supply, telecommunication. And since they went against their competitive advantages, even you privatize them, you will have to subsidize them continuously. And actually, the private owner will have a high incentive for rent seeking than the when those firms were owned by the state. And so as a result, the corruption and ransacking after the transition were even worse than in the past. And as a result, the economy performed poorly. And also Washington consensus opposed the government to play a proactive role in facilitating firms' entry to new sectors with the country's competitive advantages. So, and you can consider some of the old industry collapse, but without government facilitation, new industry cannot emerge. So the country will have this kind of deindustrialization. And we see that in Africa, we see that in Latin America. And the reason why those kind of gradual piecemeal approach to be successful, because in this pragmatic approach, the government continues to provide some kind of transitory protection and subsidy to the non-viable firms in the older sectors and to maintain stability. But the government also actively facilitates the private firms' entry to new sectors which are consistent with the country's competitive advantages, and so they can be competitive. And and not only so, with the rapid growth in the new sectors, the capital was accumulated. So the older sector will gradually turn from going against the country's competitive advantage to become consistent with the country's competitive advantages. The firm will turn from non-viable to viable, and the government can eliminate the protection and subsidies when the condition mature. And so they enjoy the stability and dynamic economic growth. And from the new structural economics, we can see the industrial policy would be a very essential tool for the government to play the facilitation role. Because as we argue, economic development is a process of dynamic structural transformation. You need to give incentive to the first movers, but you also need to solve the coordination issues in hard and soft infrastructures. And those are market values, and require the government support to overcome those kind of market values. But the contents of the coordination of hard and soft infrastructures will be, sector specific, industrial specific, location specific. And the government did not have sufficient resources and implementation capacity to provide adequate infrastructure for every industries and every locations. And as a result, since the government resources and implementation capacity are limited, the government will have to use those kind of limited resources and capacity strategically to support the sectors which can create the largest job, largest export, and dynamic growth for the country. And certainly those are the sectors consistent with the country's competitive advantages. And since the government need to play those kind of strategic role to allocate resources, and industrial policy will be a useful tool. But there's a lot of reservation about the industrial policy. And in fact, it became some kind of taboo in certain global development institutions. And the main reason was that almost all the developing countries used the industrial policy to support their structural transformation, but the majority of them failed. And the reason why they failed, because the government in the developing country in the past followed the structuralism and tried to be too ambitious, tried to develop industries which went against the country's competitive advantages. As a result, firms in those kind of sectors were not viable. And they require government subsidies and protections. And the government subsidies and protection will be carried out by all kinds of distortions. And that will create misallocation of resources and corruption and ransacking. And as a result, the attempt to pick winners ended up as picking the losers. And that's the reason why most industrial policy failed. But if we want to make the industrial policy successful, the industrial policy should be targeting sectors which are consistent with the country's latent competitive advantages. And my definition of latent competitive advantages is that the sectors, the factor cost of production of these sectors is among the lowest in the world. That means the production in these sectors is consistent with the factor endowment of the country. But we know that competition in the market is not a competition of factor cost of production. It's a competition of total cost. The total cost also consists of the transaction cost, and which is determined by the infrastructure and institutions and the business environment. And if the infrastructure and the business environment are not good enough, the transaction cost will be too high, and total cost will be too high, and the sector will not be competitive. And I call this kind of sector to be the latent competitive advantages of the economy. If the industrial policy try to help the sectors of the latent competitive advantages to reduce the transaction cost by improving the hard infrastructure and institution, then the transaction cost will be reduced and the sector will be competitive quickly. And that should be the sector for the industrial policy to target. But latent is not observable. And so how can we identify the sector which the country has the latent competitive advantages? And we can learn from history. Certainly most industrial policy failed, but on the other hand, all the successful countries, they adopted industrial policy. So we can try to learn the pattern of industrial policy that adopted by the successful country. And historically, we can find starting from the 16th century, 17th century, when UK tried to, catch up the Netherlands, and in the 19th century, late 19th century, when Germany, France, and the US, wanted to catch up Britain, and later on, like in the 1950s, 1960s, when the four small dragons tried to catch up Japan and so on. And we find that historically, the successful countries, they have one thing in common. In general, their industrial policy try to target the industries in countries which had a similar endowment structure. Suppose you are labor abundant, then you are targeting some labor abundant country. You are resources abundant, then you are targeting some sector in the resource abundant country. That's one thing. And then secondly, they in general targeting successful country. That means they are growing dynamically for decades or for several decades, and their per capita GDP was about 100% higher than yours. Historically, you can find this kind of pattern. And then why you should try to target the mature sector in successful country which their per capita GDP was about 100% higher than yours. Because competitive advantage is determined by endowment structure. So if the country has similar endowment structure, certainly they have similar competitive advantages. And if a country can grow in dynamically for several decades, that means most of the industry in this country must be consistent with your competitive advantages. Otherwise, they cannot grow dynamically for several decades. But if they are growing dynamically for several decades, then they must accumulate capital very fast. And if that, certainly their competitive advantage will be changing. The mature industry in the early stage of their development will gradually lose the competitive advantages. And if they are losing competitive advantages, their sunset industry will be your sunrise industry because your competitive advantage is close to theirs. And so that is the reason why we see successful countries always follow those kind of patterns. And based on this, understanding the new structural economics, design a framework called growth identification and facilitation to help the country to formulate their industrial policy. The first step is to identify fast-growing countries with similar endowment structure and with about 100 and 200% higher than your per capita GDP. And in modern time, because technological change is so fast, it can even reduce to 100 to 300% higher than your per capita GDP. Or 20, 30 years ago, you have a similar per capita GDP. Some country like China today, per capita GDP is about 5 times higher than Pakistan. But 30 years ago, actually, we have a similar income levels. So that's the principle. And identify dynamic growing tradable industry that have performed well in those countries over the last 20, 30 years. They were mature, they are going to lose the comparative advantages. So that's the first step. And this step is very important. It can avoid the government doing the wrong things, to be too ambitious, or for the government to be captured by some kind of vested group for the seeking. Sometimes the private sector will lobby the government to protect them, and then they will argue, say, this industry is so important for our future, but we cannot survive without government protections. But those kind of industry can be so modern, so advanced, so sexy, and very convincing, but actually they did not have, whatsoever comparative advantage. And this kind of protection and safety will have to go forever. So it becomes a way of, rent-seeking, and the government will be captured. So this step can help the government to do the wrong thing. And secondly, after you have a list of target industries, you can come home to see whether private enterprises already identify those kind of opportunity and enters. If you have already some private firms to enter, that means that they already have tacit knowledge there, and their factor cost of production should be lower than your comparators. But how they cannot be competitive? That must be because of the transaction costs are too high and due to inappropriate business environment or infrastructure. Then the government should help them to remove those kind of minding constraints and for those kind of private firms to scale up and also to encourage new firms to entry. And this approach incorporates the ideas of touch technology advocated by Ricardo Horstman. But some sectors may be totally new to you, and you do not have touch technology. But if your competitor country, they are going to lose their comparative advantages. They will have the incentive to relocate their production to your country to take advantage of low factor cost of production. But how come they are not coming? Now, either because they don't know your country, or your country do not have adequate hard infrastructure or business environment. And under this kind of situation, the government can set up some kind of program to court or to encourage foreign direct investment to come by removing those kind of mining constraints in hard and soft infrastructure. And I mean, the touch technology can be imported. And the first step is that we are using successful country in the past 20 or 30 years, but technology are changing so fast. So some new technology that are available now may not be available 20 or 30 years ago. For example, back office processing and those kind of business did not exist before 1980s, but your neighbor India, some firm identify those kind of opportunities and they started enter and they show profitability. Or every country has some kind of special endowments. And those kind of endowment can produce certain goods that are demanded domestically or internationally, but those kind of goods will not exist in your competitor country, but they show the profitability. And under this kind of situation, so the government should also support this kind of profit discovery and identify what are the bottlenecks for them to grow. And certainly, mostly will be in the hard infrastructure or soft institutions. And the government should help to improve the infrastructure or institution to make them even more competitive and also to encourage more entries. So that is the fourth step. And the fifth step, in every developing country, okay. In every developing country, the infrastructure was poor, almost everywhere in the nations. But resources of the government is limited. So under this kind of situation, a pragmatic approach is to set up spatial economic zone, export processing zone, or industrial parks. Within the park and a zone to make the infrastructure good enough. And certainly the country may also have poor business environment, but within the park and zone, you can have one-stop services. And by that, you can reduce the transaction cost quickly. Even you have a very poor business environment and a poor infrastructure for the whole nation. But within the park and zone, the transaction costs can be lower. And also, this is also a way to encourage the quick formation of clusters, agglomeration, and I can further reduce the transaction costs. And I can use that as a jumping pad for quick wins. And lastly, the government should provide some incentive for the first movers and to compensate for the externality. And this can be carried out by some kind of tax incentive for 3 years or 5 years. And if you have a capital control, you can have some kind of, if you have a financial repression, you can give some kind of priority access to credit for investment. And if you have the capital control, you can also give them access to foreign exchanges so they can import the equipment, machinery necessary for their investment. So that can be some kind of incentive, and this kind of incentive is limited. For example, the tax incentive, that is for 3 or 5 years. And access to the credit or the foreign exchanges, that's one time. So this kind of approach, will not have the issue of so-called subsidizing the infant industries forever. So that is the growth identification and facilitation. And use that I think Pakistan has to apply this approach. Because if you look, a few successful economies, mostly in East Asia, they capture a certain kind of opportunity. That is, the global reallocation of labor-intensive industry. For example, after the Second World War, the wages in US certainly was higher than the wages in Japan. At the time, Japan together GDP was about 30% of the US, and the wage rate in Japan was lower. And so Japan, used its wage competitiveness to enter into the labor-intensive industry and attract the relocation of labor-intensive industry from the US to Japan. And Japan, grew very rapidly after the Second World War. And by the time of the 1960s, the wage rate in Japan rose up. And at that time, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, they are middle-income economies, and their wage rate were lower. So they entered into the labor-intensive industries that released by the Japan's economy. And in the 1980s, the East Asian tigers, they became the newly industrialized economies. They reached high middle income or even high income. And China at that time just opened our economy and our wage rate was low. So we capture that opportunities. So it was something like a flying geese model. And that is, all the successful countries basically follow those kind of model to capture the opportunities. And as you know, 42 years ago, China's per capita income was only about 60% of Pakistan. 42 years ago, 1978, when China started the transition, the per capita GDP in China was only about 60% of Pakistan. In 1990s, 30 years ago, the per capita GDP in China was only at the same level as the Pakistan, as you can see in this, in these figures. But now China's per capita GDP is about 6.5 times of Pakistan. And certainly, China already gradually loses the competitive advantages in the labor-intensive industries. And China had 85 million manufacturing job in light manufacturing, in labor-intensive industry. China will, for China to continue to increase its income, China will have to upgrade to the capital-intensive industry, technological-intensive industries, and leave open the labor-intensive industries. And if Pakistan can capture this opportunity to attract foreign direct investment from China, or to encourage the domestic firm to enter the labor-intensive industry in Pakistan, and I'm sure the Pakistan has the opportunity to be as successful as China in the past 40 years, to enjoy 8% or even 10% growth rate continuously for 3 or 4 decades, and to become a high-income country within 1 generation or at most 2 generations. But here I have 2 additional recommendations. So far, I only talk about the modernization in the manufacturing sector. Certainly, it's important because all the countries started in the early stage of development in agriculture, in agrarian economy, and were poor. And if they want to be successful, reach high income, certainly they will have our migration from the agricultural sector to modern manufacturing sectors, climb up the industrial ladders, graduate to the service sectors. That's the pattern. But at this stage, agriculture is still important for Pakistan because among your 210 million populations, 60% and more live in rural area, rely on agriculture for livings. And so agricultural modernization will be essential for the poverty reduction in Pakistan. And agricultural modernization, you need to provide better technology, better seeds for the current crops. And you also need to create a condition for the farmer to diversify from the staple food, staple crops to the cash crop, and those kind of modernization process. And for that, you need to provide better technology, better infrastructure, and also better financing. So for this, certainly is also important for Pakistan today. And secondly, we are talking about industrialization, but currently, Pakistan, like other countries, is hit by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so every country encounters some kind of pandemic recession. And with the recession, certainly unemployment shoot up, the government revenue reduced, export also reduced. And so the resources for the government can utilize to support the industrialization, as I discussed in my earlier presentation, would be reduced. And I think that for the currently, the most important job for Pakistan government is to help the existing firms. You already have some firms there. And you should give them some kind of trade credit, tax exemption, or debt restructuring to maintain them. Because if they go bankrupt, then it's going to cause unemployment issue. And once they go bankrupt, it will also be hard for them to to start their business again. So to help the existing firm. And also, as I mentioned, to have an industrial park, special economic zone, expropriation zone will be a useful tool to get quick wins. But because the resources that you can have to start a new park, new zone will be limited. And also understand that in Pakistan, you already have many industrial parks. And the most important thing is to make those kind of existing industrial park or expropriation zone to work. You need to help them to have good access to reliable access to electricities. And you should really implement the one-stop service to reduce their transaction costs. Give them some priority for custom clearing and so on, so they can be competitive. And also certainly to attract foreign direct investment is important. But equally important is to retain those kind of FDIs they are already in Pakistan. You should help them to be successful. And then they will become a model to attract more foreign direct investment to come. So that is what the Pakistan to do now in this year or in next year. But after the situation return to normal, the government may utilize the new structural economic industrial policy framework, that's growth identification and facilitation, to identify the industries that are consistent with Pakistan or that the Punjab province or other provinces' competitive advantages, and then to use the foreign direct investment promotion or to build up the industrial park expropriation zone and to help them to turn the latent competitive advantages into the competitive advantage of the nation for job creation and for scaling up. And when you have a large enough clusters, then more and more firms, not only foreign direct investment, the domestic firm can also enter. And I think that is the way to achieve dynamic, sustainable, and certainly now we need to have a green growth, green industrialization. So in this process, they can also adopt the green technology for their development. So overall, my concluding is that Pakistan, like any other country or like China, 30 years ago, has the potential to grow dynamically for decades and to become a middle income or even a high income country in 1 or 2 generations. As long as the government has the right industrial policy to facilitate the private sectors to specialize on sectors of the country's comparative advantages and help latent comparative advantages to become the nation's competitive advantages. And the new structural economy, the growth identification and facilitation will be a good framework for Pakistan to capture these opportunities. And the time is short, but I'd like to recommend a few books. You can download the new structural economics from the World Bank in our website. It's free. Or if you're interested, you can also get access to the Quest for Prosperity published by the Princeton University Press. And also the Between the Arts, also published by Princeton University Press. And Going Beyond AIDS is published by Cambridge University Press. So let me stop here. I appreciate very much your attention, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you my ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lin. My name is Nadeem Ul Haq. I'm sorry for being a little late. Unfortunately, I had web problems, but I got almost all of your talk, except for the introduction that my people gave. But this is really a very interesting, very enjoyable talk. Lots of new ideas. In particular, you got us away from the old debate on neoliberalism versus controlled economy. In particular, you got us to think about how this new structural economics will work, in particular, especially in regard to getting an industrial policy going, how to take advantage of the changing dynamics in the world. I have a few questions before I go to the audience. A very simple question, first of all. I think what you've outlined is a large number of policy initiatives that the government would probably have to take to make this policy work. I'm not disagreeing with any of those. I think they're all very good. You talked about coordination. You talked about lowering transactions costs. You talked about finding comparative advantages, and in particular, keeping a check on how the dynamic comparative advantages are moving, because comparative advantages are all about focusing for the future. And therefore, the government should be able to pick out where the dynamic comparative advantage is going. Secondly, you also talked about the endowment structure of the country. Now, let me think about it. We are used to thinking of endowment structure as physical endowments. Are we taking into account the institutional and endowments, the history that the government has gone through, the historical development? At the same time, when the government has so many different initiatives to take, is what sort of role does information play in the economy? I find that in Pakistan, for example, we did try and follow a comparative advantage. For example, we put in place a textile industry. Then we thought, oh, we must catch up with the West, and we must put in place an engineering industry. So we did. Then we thought agriculture was important, so we put in a fertilizer industry, and we started doing agriculture things. In each of these initiatives, where we failed really was the fact that somehow our policies were neither well thought out, nor well delivered. So my question to you very simply is, what kind of a state? What would you think? And this is a question I think we economists generally don't tend to face, because in all our theories, there is no government. Well, we criticize the government, but from microeconomics to macroeconomics, there's no government. So the question is, what kind of a government are you looking for? And how can a developing country like Pakistan, with its history, with its history of colonialism, with its other histories, how do we get that kind of a government? So should we think of fixing the institutions first, or should we only think of capturing the new industrial structures?
Very good question, and a very important questions. And my advice is to be pragmatic. There are so many things are desirable, but your resources, your implementation capacity are limited. And your people cannot wait because they want the government to prepare.
Mm-hmm.
And so under the kind of situation, instead of trying to improve institution for the whole nations, it will take century before the institution to be desirable. But your people cannot wait, not a century, even 1 year or 2 years. That's one thing. And actually, your institution or implementation capacity compared to, let's say, East Asian economies, you should be proud of yourself. Remember from Ha Jin Chong, he is a professor now working at Oxford University, and he is a Korean. In one of the book, he has one story. In 1970, the World Bank gave a grant to Korean government in order to send their official to Pakistan for the purpose of learning how to govern. So that means Pakistan in 1970s, your implementation capacity, your government, your governance was considered as better than Korea. But Korea, with very poor implementation capacity and governance, they were able to become so successful. So even institution and so on, there are many areas to improve. But I think it has sufficient of that. And for that, as I recommend, one pragmatic approach will be started to identify sectors which you have latent comparative advantages. Certainly, you want to have, so-called dynamic comparative advantages, 20 years, industries as your target. But you need to start from now. Started from you have now, that's your endowments, And what you can do well now, that is your latent competitive advantages. And use a pragmatic approach, that's your industrial parks. And I'm sure, your government will have the ability to ensure a small number of industrial parks to have good enough infrastructure, even if the nation is poor. And within these industrial parks, to have good institution, good business environment, even for the whole nation's business environment is poor. And to use that as a jumping pad for that natural park to turn the sector which you have competitive advantages, for example, textile and garment, to be very competitive. And for that, you can generate jobs, exports, government revenues, and the people will get a confidence on the government, show the government can deliver, and the government will have more resources to expand the industrial park and so on. And gradually, you can have, this kind of sustained growth to happen. And, and if you look to the successful country, you can in China. If you look in the 1990s, 2000, the business environment, according to the World Bank in China, was very poor. And even up to today, if you look into the business environment in Vietnam, very poor. But how come they can have so successful industrialization, growing so dynamically? I think because they follow this kind of pragmatic approach, as I just described. So I think that, Pakistan, if you follow this kind of pragmatic approach, focus on something that you can make it happen, and based on what you have, what you can do well, and with the government support to scale up what you can do well, and be sure you can be successful.
No, fair enough. I entirely accept your view on the pragmatic economics and pragmatic approach. And certainly, I think that's the best way to go. But even in terms of following the pragmatic approach, in this day and age, the information required is huge. We have, for example, large number of international agencies now offering us advice and money and all kind of incentives are at work. The government has many dimensions of the economy to study, not just industrialization. But if you look at the SDG goals, we've got about, I think 18 times 7 or 8. We've got about maybe 200-300 goals that we have to look at. I'm just worried about the, like yourself, I've worked in a number of countries. I've worked in Africa, in South Asia, many countries. And I find the information overload for the governments, for the nascent governments to be able to carry on the information overload and the analytical overload, even for the pragmatic approach that you called for, which is absolutely correct. I think we should be pragmatic, and there should be an evolutionary approach because, quite frankly, things change all the time, and we should be even. But the question is, how do we get the government to be able to develop that pragmatic approach, especially when they've got so many bits of advice and bits of things that are happening to them? Well, let me put it slightly differently. Would this pragmatic approach have worked in the China of the 1930s, or did you require the revolution to prepare China to take this pragmatic approach? I mean, if you go back and do a counterfactual for me, let's think of China in the 1930s before the revolution. How successful would this policy have been there?
Well, the first one, let me answer your first question first. Certainly, you receive a lot of advice. And in new structural economics is somewhat different ideas. But if I compare the ideas from the new structural economics and the ideas from any other advice you receive, the difference is that other advice always use the high-income country as reference to look at what the high-income country have and use that to see what you do not have. Encourage you to own what the high-income country have. Or to look at what the high-income country can do well or relatively well, and you could not do well, and ask you to follow how the high-income country are doing. or to look at what are considered as important in high-income country and assume that are also important in your country, and encourage you to follow, their programs. Intentions are always good, but actually, I did not see any evidence of those kind of approach to be successful. And further in structural economics, just different. First, look at what we have. And certainly that's your endowments. And based on what you have, what you can do well, that's your comparative advantages. And what are important? Those things to help you to scale up what you can do well. Those are the important things. And if you follow this approach, you can do things immediately. You can deliver immediately. And that's the best way to convince your people that is the right approach. And that is also the best way to defend yourself from the pressure from internationally. For example, SDG 17 goals. Some are ends, some are means. For example, the first one, no poverty. The second one, zero hunger. The third one, good health. And the first one, good education. They are all desirable. But I think what should be the foundation for that? You should give the people decent jobs. If they have decent job, they will have their income. If their income certainly will not be, they can get rid of poverty. If they have good income, certainly, then they will not be hungry. If they have good income, they will take care of their own health. They will have good health. If they have good income, certainly, you will support your children's education, right? But how to give the people decent job? Industrialization. Without new technology in agricultural sectors, without industrialization, then you cannot give decent job. So under this kind of situation, if you follow what I just recommend, to have this kind of, to jumpstart your industrialization, which labor intensive, can provide many, many jobs, and also it can be competitive. So you can achieve, goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, goal 4, and many other goals. So we need to have our own understanding about the nature and the causes of development. And we should not just follow the predictions based on the theory in the high-income country or otherwise in the high-income country. And the way to defend yourself is to deliver, to show my approach delivers. Any approach, for example, everyone says governance is important, but how many years do we need to take to improve the governance? And also look back. In the United States or in the European country, if you read the Wealth of Nations, you can see a lot of corruption, rent-seeking, widespread in UK's in the 18th century. It's almost for every page of the Wealth of Nations in UK's. But even with those poor governance, UK become industrialized. So we need to get the things right. High-income country always what they are doing now, what they have now, what they consider important for their country, and assume that also important to us. So in a way, politically, we get independence from colonies, but they try to colonize our ideas all the time, and that will not be successful. So that's my response to your question.
Oh, sorry. Let me take some questions from the floor. Arfa Iqbal.
Thank you. Professor Justin, this had been really very, very informative, very interesting lecture or talk, whatever you call it. You very rightly pointed out that it is the country's inability to have a dynamic structural change which leads them to lower income trap and middle income trap. Totally agreed. And then you also came up with a very beautifully structured, the new structural economics model of step 1 to step 6. Totally agree with that. There can't be any second opinion. Now, my question is actually building up on what Mr. Nadeem already said, that I'm struggling to figure out how to bridge the gap between all this beautiful theory and the actual implementation status. It has been like now more than 7 years of BRI and China-Pakistan economic corridor and special economic zones. But practically, how many FDIs do we see in Pakistan? How much Pakistan has benefited from China's relocating labor-intensive industry, despite all these political rhetoric, political commitment on both sides, despite having special economic zones, despite having all the JCCs of CPEC, I can yet not see any substantial colonization of our special economic zones or China's labor intensive industry coming to Pakistan. So I really don't know, being part of the government, how to hit the nail, where to hit the nail, how to come up with that pragmatic approach that you are referring to. Thank you.
Very good questions. And certainly, very good questions. Unless we see the result, but otherwise it will always on the papers. But to see the result, the number one things, the secret of the success of China is all the programs are the governance program, the programs, the prime minister's programs. If you want to have different direct investment to come, you need to court them. And how to give the confidence of different investors, you need to have the support from your leaderships. Because, for example, you have those kind of special economic zone, and you have the industrial parks. They may have their promotion package. But if you want to really make those kind of policy to realize, that will be huge barriers for the foreign investor to overcome. And the way to change the dynamic is that if you have the attention of your chief ministers or attention of your minister directly, and give insurance to the investors. I have this law there. And if you try to get through those kind of law, you encounter any problem, it's not you to go to the government, tell me, and I'll go to the government, help you to solve that. If you can do that, then the investor will come. And their success will attract more investors. And so that's the reason why, at the end, I say what you should do now, actually, retention of those people who already come and to help them to be successful would be the best way for investment promotion. And last time when I went to Pakistan in 2017, I heard all kinds of complaints from the investors. They say, before I receive all those promises. But once I made investment and I want to, have those kind of promise, but almost just like try to overcome a mountain. So I think that is the way. You need to make things happen instead of on the papers. And if you can do that, then things will happen. I can give you some, if you read my writings, I can give you some example. For example, like in Ethiopia, when they tried to, I did a study for Ethiopia when I was at the World Bank, and advised Ethiopia, they should have competitive advantage in the laser sectors, shoe sectors. And because their wage rate is only 1/10 of China's wage rate. And we know that in the shoe sectors, the labor cost was about 30% of total cost. And if the firm in China relocate those production from China to Ethiopia, Then, because
Go.
it's
Don't touch
one,
its complete.
the,
Okay. अगर वो
the
iPad
wedge-
वगैरह यूज करने को बंद कर दें.
So there's some interruption. Oh, sorry. Can you hear
No,
me?
please, Professor, go on.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I think that you need to have some kind of, give the confidence of the investors. And the best way to give the confidence of the investor is to have a direct involvement of your leadership, kind of investment promotion project. And that can make those kind of policy in the investment promotion package to be implemented. Otherwise, the investors will have too much difficulty. And one way that you can do is to have some kind of meetings with the investors, periodically. If you cannot give them your telephone number, ask them to call you, at least you can have meeting with them every 3 months, listen to their report about what kind of difficulty they encounters. And you help them to remove those kind of difficulties. And by this, if your investors to be successful, it will be the best way to demonstrate and best way for investment promotion.
Okay. Mr. Tahir Sheikh, sorry. Tahir Sheikh. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me, sir? Yeah.
We can, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. I have two questions, and these relate to essentially, because your main premise on this is for policies to be sustainable, there needs to be a link to the comparative advantage. Okay, one can shoot for, say, 100% or 200% of GDP when you are trying to identify the comparative advantage. But when you really look, say, for example, in Malaysia, I think Malaysia of 70s, basically rubber plantations, tin mining, and then you see that Intel comes in there, right? And then that kickstarts the whole electronics sector, right? No link with the comparative advantage in that context, maybe. Or for example, when you look at India, it is said that the software industry or the IT revolution was because government just kept its hands off, right? Rather than interfering in the sector or being very hands-on, it just didn't intervene, right? So how does one explain this? Thank you.
Very good. In my growth identification and facilitation, step 3, answer your first questions. Because Malaysia in the 1970s, its income level was similar to Taiwan. Taiwan also at that time started their computer chip packaging and testing, because of packaging and testing was very intensive in the computer chip productions. And so their income level was similar to Taiwan in the 1970s. And it was new, and so they did not have those kind of technological capacity. So they imported those kind of capacity from foreign direct investment. For Malaysia, it was an investment from Intel. From Taiwan, in Taiwan, it was an investment from Texas Instrument. And they entered into the lower end of the labor-intensive end of computer chip productions. So that's follow mine. And for the India's case, in the information processing, as the opportunity was identified by the entrepreneurs, but the government also helped, because when the information processing in India in the early 1980s, they rely on textile satellite communication by through the Texas Instruments had one investment in India, and they had some kind of satellite communication channels. At the beginning, they relied on those kind of satellite telecommunication, and it was quite expensive. And it was possible for India to have such successful information sectors was because the improvement in the land-based telecommunication. And that's also in my first step. You have entrepreneurs identify new approach due to the new technology made those kind of business possible. And they show the profitability. The government should help them to remove the bottleneck. In the case of India, the bottleneck was to change from satellite telecommunication to those kind of land-based telecommunications.
Vijay sir.
Professor Lin, thank you for a great lecture. So my question is that what you have suggested seems to place a great, huge responsibility on the government. Identify comparative advantage, identify the firms that can produce those products in which the country enjoys comparative advantage. If the firms are not present, attract FDI, again, the government is involved, have industrial parks, then locate the right kind of industries there. Do you think all this is possible without good institutions, which you say that then these can come later? And all this is, and without a good institution, do you think there won't be any rent seeking?
Well, I think the Pakistan Institute of Development Studies should have the capacity to follow those kind of growth identification and facilitation, and advise your Ministry of Planning, because that step is very simple, very clear. The criterion is easy to understand and also to follow. And that's one thing. And secondly, it's not totally a government mandate, because the first step certainly rely on the government. But the second step, third step, fourth step actually rely on the private sectors. Because the second step that you already some private firm enter, right? So private firm already enter, they identify the opportunities. And the third step, if you do not, the foreign investors in your competitor country, they are losing competitive advantages. They will seeking opportunity in other countries with similar endowment structures, but at a lower stage of development with a lower wages. They will have a high incentive to come, just like the previous speaker say, Intel came to Malaysia in the 1970s. Texas Instrument came to Taiwan also in the 1960s, 1970s. They came because they are seeking economies with low wages, and with the government can provide the infrastructure. So they will come, and you need to help them to remove the mining constraint, and then quickly you can build up those kind of industries. So that's also identified by the private sectors. The first step, certainly also private sectors identify that opportunity already, but they encounter the bottleneck in business environment or in infrastructure. And the government listen to them and certainly can help them to do that.
Sorry, Mohammed Khurram Shabir.
Thank you. Am I audible, sir?
You are indeed.
Okay, thank you. I just want to thank Justin Lin for giving a wonderful presentation and a session. I have a question to ask that.
यार device और है तो दे दें एक device मुझे.
That in one of the last slides, so you mentioned that China is heading towards high growth industry, And Pakistan can take this advantage by taking the space left by China in the labor-intensive industries. However, sir, with the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence, in future machines are supposed to be taking most of the jobs. It's expected. So shouldn't so how do you think labor intensive can be comparative in this regard in future? Shouldn't Pakistan and the developing countries should be more focusing on machine learning and artificial intelligence? Could you please tell sir in this regard? Thank
Very
you.
good questions. Very good questions. The first one, the artificial intelligence and so on, need investment. And certainly we have some talking about the possibility to use artificial intelligence and automation in the labor-intensive sectors. But the scope of that is not that large. Because in the labor-intensive sectors, the value of the output is not high, but the automation cost can be very high. Because, for example, textile or garment, the materials is very soft. And if you want to use automation for sewing and so on, those kind of machine will be even more expensive than the robot in the automotive, the car sectors. But a piece of, you need to have 100,000 pieces of clothes to equivalent to a car, right? So under that kind of situation, the incentive to use automation in the labor-intensive sectors is so far not high. Maybe 20 years, 30 years from now, the AI is so advanced and everything can be, use robots to produce. That may happen 20, 30 years from now. But for Pakistan, the best way is to use your labor force to enter in that sectors, to accumulate capitals. So by the time those kind of machines become available and affordable, you have the capital to, invest. If to accumulate capitals, even those kind of opportunity comes, you don't have anything to invest in those kind of sector, you are going to lose that opportunities. So just like my answer to the dynamic competitive advantages, we know that the idea of dynamic competitive advantage was very popular during the structuralism. They say, well, the competitive advantage, you need to reach the advanced sectors, and that should be your competitive advantage in the futures. But those kind of advanced industries, they are more capital intensive. And if you do not start with your competitive advantage now, you cannot accumulate capital. And those kind of more capital intensive sectors will be too capital intensive to you all the time. And the way that you start with your competitive advantages, you can accumulate capital very fast. And then you will have the ability to upgrade your industry very fast. So the way to achieve competitive advantages is to start with the competitive advantage you have now. And so that's similar to the possibility for automation in the futures. The best way to prepare yourself for the optimization in the futures is to accumulate capital now. And so when those kind of technology become available, you will have the capital to invest. And how to accumulate capitals, rely on your competitive advantage now you have today.
Thank you, Professor Lin. Thank you very much. I think this has been a wonderful webinar. One final question to you, Professor Lin. We at the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics have been thinking for a long time, and we want to operationalize this after COVID ends, that CPEC has kind of put us together in terms of building hard infrastructure. And you yourself in your talk talked about the soft infrastructure, which is equally important. And in our analysis, we've done a lot of work in the PID We've made a growth agenda for the country. We've done a lot of work on the development part of the country. We think the soft infrastructure is very important for Pakistan, and probably more important for us than at any other stage of our development. So what we'd like to see is how we can connect with the Chinese thinking sector, with the Chinese universities and the Chinese think tanks in a very real research sense, to be able to develop ideas together. I think that's where our CPEC is lacking. Our CPEC doesn't seem to have a software part, it seems to have a hardware part only. So how can we get you to help us to develop a software part of the CPEC?
Well, that's a very good question. It's fortunate we have participant from the Chinese embassy, and we can propose to them to be successful. You not only to have hard infrastructure, you also need to have soft institutions, and ideas are most important things. And so to make our cooperation to be successful, China already support substantially in hard infrastructure. And since hard infrastructure is ready, now we need to have the soft institutions and ideas. And that will be a very high payoff for our collaboration. So hope that you can formally send a proposal to the embassy or to the CPEC, and then certainly then we can work together. And I'll be looking forward to that opportunities.
We will certainly send it to the embassy. We've talked to the ambassador before, and we will certainly send you a request as well that we should participate much more in bringing the two countries together in terms of thought and research, and not just in terms of transactional relationship. We need to get much more into a thought relationship. So with that, thank you, Professor Lin. It's been a very instructive, very, very wonderful talk. I've enjoyed it enormously. A lot to learn. I apologize for my net difficulties. It made it difficult for me to get in there, but I must say that this will not be our last interaction. We'll call on you again and again to help us understand more, because your words have a lot of impact on our students. Pakistanis really, look up to China, and hearing from you will really help us do a lot of things in terms of developing our research and thinking. So thank you, Professor Lin. All the best. Inshallah, we'll meet again.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'll send my PowerPoints. And so you can
please do
review the PowerPoints.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very good.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you
this
very much.
opportunity. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.